What's up guys, welcome to Create and Fabricate. Today I'm going to take you on a journey full of ups and downs, frustration and salvation as we explore and build my take on a modern farmhouse style coffee table with a lift top lid for storage. So let's get started. As always, I start in Sketchup. It's a free, easy to use program where you can design almost anything in 3D space. I prefer to do this over drawing because if you want to change anything, it's just a click of a button. No erasing and redrawing over faded pencil lines. I wanted to keep the design simple, so I designed it to be made from two 2x10s and two 2x4s. The top and the shelf will be made from 2x10s, and the legs will be made from 2x4s glued together. The skirt/storage section of the table will be made from 2x10s ripped in half. I was originally planning on using a 2x4, however, after putting the plywood on the bottom, I felt like 3 inches of depth wouldn't be enough for storage. I cut the 2x10s down to their final length. First cutting the top 2 pieces to 36 inches long, and then the bottom shelf pieces to 34 inches long. Then I finally cut 2 pieces for the skirt, one at 28 inches and one at 10 inches. Then all I had to do was cut down 8 pieces of 2x4s for the legs. It was pretty rough and quick. I didn't care about all of them being the exact same length as I'd take care of that later. With all the cuts done, it was time to bring out the table saw. I mainly used the table saw just to take off the rounded edges of the lumber. Some of you might have already figured out if I did that with the 2x10 top, it would have been less than 18 inches wide, and you'd be right. However, I only took a 1/4 inch off one side, knowing I'd be using a 3/8 round over bit on the edges once it was all glued together. That would hide any of the uneven rounded edges that came with the lumber. So the way I run everything through the table saw is I just go through my cut list, starting with the widest going to the narrowest. 9 inches wide for the top, then 8.5 inch wide for the shelves, 4 inches for the skirt, then finally I cut the 2x4s down to 3 inches. Of course, making sure I cut off equal amounts on both sides to get rid of the rounded edges. I wasn't exactly sure of the right order to assemble this beast of a project. I started by gluing the legs together, as well as the top and the shelves. Generally, wood glue takes 24 hours to cure. However, just a few hours is enough to give you workable strength. So 2 hours later, I came back to the project to flatten and round over the corners of the top. First, I started with the belt sander and some 80 grit sandpaper. Then went to 120 grit. Then I used my new palm router to give these edges a nice 3/8 round over that I was talking about earlier. And guys, this piece of equipment is worth it. Yes, I have a regular router, but it's a lot heavier, making it harder to use on things like edges. The bigger ones are more meant to be mounted upside down on tables. A palm router is made to be light and maneuverable. Once I was done with the router, I took my random orbit sander and went from 80 grit all the way up to 220. Some of you might be wondering why I used 80 grit on the random orbital sander when I already used 80 and 120 on the belt sander. A belt sander is great for taking off material and making sure everything's flat, but it leaves marks on your wood in the direction the belt's spinning. The whole reason I use 120 grit on the belt sander is just to get rid of the marks the 80 grit sandpaper leaves. The random orbit sander is known specifically for not leaving any marks on your project. So even though I've sanded to a higher grit, I go back to 80 and work through 220 to get rid of those marks. After that, I decided the best and cleanest way to put the bottom of the storage compartment in was to cut grooves on the inside of the skirt pieces for the plywood to sit in. I went with 1/4 inch plywood, and a saw blade is 1/8 of an inch wide. I made my first pass, then I came back and set the fence to 1/2 inch and made my second pass. This gave me a perfectly snug groove for the plywood to sit in. Normally, to make all the legs the same length, I'd clamp them all together and grind them down with the belt sander. Yes, I'm fully aware that that's not the most effective method, but hey, I'm still new to the game. As I had the table saw out for the grooves, I was wondering if I could use it to make all the legs the same length. So I raised the blade to 3 inches and squared off one of the ends using my miter gauge, making sure it was set to 0 degrees. Then I sent the fence to 14 inches, which is the final length of my legs, and ran them through with the already squared end up against the fence, cutting all 4 legs to the same size. After that, I brought out the planer. This is a new toy of mine, and I can't believe I didn't get one sooner. I haven't used one since high school, and I totally forgot how handy they actually are. It's so easy to make things perfectly flat and smooth. I used it to make sure all 4 sides of the table legs were the same size. And oh man, was I amazed. I already have some plans for future projects where I'm going to use the crap out of this thing. The last thing to do before a final glue up is to cut the 3" by 3" notches in the corners of the shelf and the storage compartment bottom for the legs to pass through. Rather than measure out 3" by 3", I decided to trace the top of the leg. This was a good idea, but what wasn't a good idea was to use a jigsaw. It's extremely hard to know you're cutting a perfectly straight line when your saw is directly on top of what you've already cut. The first few cuts I made were not at all straight. I tried to come back with a circular saw and straighten them up, but that left me with more issues. The blade is a circle, so you don't fully cut through the wood right at the corner. So I tried to clean that up with a jigsaw, but it didn't seem to help. Eventually, I used a chisel to get these lines kind of straight, but that was right before the glue up and I don't think I filmed it. I did the exact same thing with the 1/4" plywood, but I quickly found out if you're not careful, you can rip off the top layer of plywood. In the end, I just ended up using the circular saw to cut those as well. The glue up went surprisingly well. I used the flattest surface I had, the top of a tool chest. I assembled the skirt and the legs upside down, that way the top of the legs and the skirt would be completely flush. I first drilled 3/8 holes that were about 1 inch deep, this way the screw would penetrate at least 1 inch into the skirt. Then I put some glue on the joints and used 3" wood screws to hold everything together, checking to make sure everything was square along the way. Then I would come back later and fill the hole with the dowel, giving the illusion I used super cool dowel joinery. The next day, I was so excited to attach the hinges I purchased, I decided to try and make them fit before even attaching the bottom shelf. That's when I realized I made a pretty big mistake. When designing the coffee table, I did not at all take into consideration the size of the hinges while they were closed. I was considering putting in a block just to mount them, and then cutting out a small groove with the router so they fully close. However, no matter what I did, I couldn't hide the fact that they were simply a 1/4" taller than the sides of the storage compartment I was planning on hiding them in, and I definitely can't have the lid sitting a 1/4" off the skirt. Without completely changing the table or starting over, I couldn't use them. I was so excited to have a coffee table with a top that lifts up for eating, and I put a lot of work into what I had done so far, and I didn't want to disassemble anything. So after a few minutes of thinking and more time than I'd like to admit sulking, I came up with an idea. I could simply use door hinges and just have the top lift up like a storage chest. So I went to Lowe's and picked up a pair of door hinges that were powder coated black for $7. Satisfied with my solution, I decided to attach the lower shelf. This presented even more challenges. I was planning on using the exact same method before to attach the shelves, except my first 2 screws went right through the wood and cracked it. And yes, I know it's because I wasn't drilling straight. But I decided the best thing to do would be to simply glue and clamp it together. But I couldn't simply glue it together. Things were already in place and there wasn't any wiggle room. So I clamped the shelf in place and then I poured glue down the cracks from my not at all straight cuts that I made the day before. I simply put a bead of glue on top and let gravity do its thing, wiping away any excess after. Then I cut a bunch of 5/16 dowels 4 inches long and grabbed my 5/16 drill bit. It's also 4 inches long, so I drilled into the leg as far as I could and then hammered the dowel in. At first I was using glue, but the dowel didn't go in easily and I ended up breaking a few of them. So I just put them in glueless after that. The next day I came back to cut off the extra dowel sticking out of the leg, as well as route out some holes for the hinges to sit in. To cut off the dowels, I used my reciprocating saw with a 5-inch metal blade. A metal blade has the most teeth per inch, and I figured it would give me the cleanest cut. I made sure to cut a 1/16 of an inch out from the edge of the leg. This way I wouldn't cut into the leg by accident, and I'd easily be able to sand down these dowels as they're just made of poplar. To mount the hinges, I traced out their shape and made sure to cut the recess a bit wider than the actual hinge. That way if I needed to move anything around a bit to get everything square, I'd have the room. This part again went surprisingly well. I used a 1/4 inch up spiral bit, starting in the middle and taking the bulk of the material out first, then taking my time and doing the final cuts along the lines. As for the lid, I did the exact same thing. The one thing I did differently here was I made a second, deeper recess than the first one, where the actual hinge would sit. This allows the flange of the hinge to sit flush on the bottom of the lid, so it doesn't stick out and you don't get this gap I'm showing you here. Then, I test fit everything together before the finishing stages. I was extremely happy with the way it turned out. The way I designed the overhang actually forces the lid to stop opening at about 120 degrees, which was totally not planned, but I'm so amazed that it worked out the way it did. It kind of makes me look like I know what I'm doing. I wanted to do more polyurethane coats on the lid than on the base, so I decided to give it a head start over the base and stain it while I was finishing up the base with wood filler and sanding. I also haven't used this stain before and I really wanted to see its color. At first I didn't like it. I felt like it looked a bit too bright. You'll see in a bit though that finishing it with polyurethane really darkens it and brings out the color of the stain. So the stain I'm using is an oil-based stain, Varathane's Ultimate Stain in American. Yes, American is the color. It worked well. Wipe on, wait 3 minutes, then wipe off the excess. Since it's an oil-based stain and I'm coating the top with a water-based poly, it's best to leave the stain a full day before adding poly on top. The can says it's ready for a top coat within an hour, but I'm pretty sure that's if you're using an oil-based top coat. Either way, I let it sit the 24 hours. Better safe than sorry. While that was drying, I spent the next night using wood filler and sanding the whole base. It took a lot of work, it was really time consuming, but it's the little details like this that I feel really make a nice piece to come together at the end. Now I can easily stain it. While waiting for the base to dry, I added a coat of polyurethane to the top. It's also something new I've never used before. It's called Varathane's Triple Thick One Coat Clear Finish. It's extremely viscous compared to regular polyurethane and the Minwax polyacrylic that I use. Honestly though, one coat was enough on the base, which I'm quite happy about, but it does cost twice as much, so that's a bit of a toss-up. I applied a coat of stain to the base of the project the same way. Wipe on, 3 minutes, wipe off. Because of this 3-minute rule, I had to do it in stages. I could only do about 2 square feet before I had to wipe it off. I was also working in 30 degrees Celsius heat, which made the excess stain thicken up quickly. So if I let it sit for more than 3 minutes, this turned into a huge issue. And this did happen a few times. I would have to wipe off, re-stain the area, then get a clean rag, and work really hard to get all that excess stain off. Before I put a 4th coat of polyurethane on the top, check out how clean and smooth this is. I added 1 more coat to the top and then 1 coat to the base. I wanted to really test this self-leveling feature of the polyurethane, so I put way too much on the final coat. And I was pleased to see that it worked out pretty well. It's also worth noting I only put 2 coats on the bottom of the lid. It looked and felt smooth. Also, you need to better protect the top side from spills and water damage, so having a few extra coats is always better. But you don't really need to protect the underside, unless one day gravity isn't a thing. A few hours later, to finish it off, I dry sanded with 600 grit and then went back and wet sanded with 1200 grit. This might seem like excess to some, but it worked out really well. The tabletop is definitely the smoothest thing I've ever built. Once I reattached the lid to the bottom, it was finally done. I'm so glad this is finally done. It was a very time-consuming build, but well worth it. I definitely think I captured the rustic farmhouse vibe with a twist of modern that I was kind of going for. I really like how the top turned out. It's smooth with a bit of shine, yet it shows the grain pattern quite well. The black powder coat hinges really tie the thing together. The color of the stain has really grown on me too. It definitely shows the characteristics of the wood off well. If you like what you saw, I recommend subscribing so you never miss an upload. I upload every Friday. Also make sure to hit the like button. It really helps out a young channel like mine. Thanks for watching.
Oh my god.
Hey guys. How are you guys doing?
When do we stop? Oh my god!
So it's best to do them kind of at the similar time, so you have a bit of... It does cost twice as much, so that's a bit of a toss-up. Hang on, man. 3 paragraphs to go. Ash. He wants to be on TV, he's complaining.
Yeah.
Trying to film here, man. You got something to say? You got something to say? Okay. I learned my lesson. Is that so? Oh yeah? Okay. Let me know when you're done so I can finish these 2 paragraphs.